There may be others who have joined and are viewing. We want to welcome you all. I'm Ted Baker, and I'm the acting chairman of the Spokane County Republican, not Republican. I met the Republican twice, and I'm stuck now. Constitution Party of Spokane County. And we have present with us in the red shirt over here, Bob Peck, who is our state chairman. We have the privilege of having him in our area, and actually we're able to view this and to be streaming because of his technical abilities and equipment. And thank you, Bob, for that. And I'm going to have Bob introduce the discussion that we're going to have this evening relative to the lesser magistrate, something that may be new to many of you, and very interesting information that we'll learn from this. And so there are several segments, very short segments, and probably what we will do is play a segment, and then we will take some time to discuss it. So any of you that want to plug in how that's possible, to inject your comments or to chat, we'd encourage you to do so.
Right, and if you are watching online, you're hopefully watching from our Constitution Party of Washington website. That's the link that we sent out. And on that page, it's actually not in the public view, but anybody can go there by entering cpofwa.org/live-stream. And if you go to that page, you hopefully will be seeing this video playing. And then right below it, there's a chat box where you can type in a message and send it to us, and Karen can be monitoring that. And I think when you type in your message for the first time and click to enter it, it'll ask you if you want to post anonymous or put up your username so we know who you are. And so hopefully that'll be fun if we can get people used to using this kind of a system, and we can make our local meeting benefit more people than just us.
And would you want to repeat those instructions in case someone is interested in hearing that again?
Right. Our page where this is supposed to be located is cpofwa.org/live-stream. And at the top of the page will be the player showing this video. And below it is the chat feature, where you just, at the bottom of the chat feature, you type in your message, click enter, and the first time you do it, it'll offer to either post it anonymously, or you can type in a username. And it'll just be for this session. You just type in your name or some anonymous name that you want to go by, but it'd be nice to know who's posting and who's joining us. So hopefully people will do that. And this is a way we can benefit others and hopefully get other people around our state to join us and learn and grow together. So the message, yes, as Ted was pointing out, this is the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, and it's by Matt Truella, who's a pastor in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. And I knew of him from several years ago at Constitution Party meetings. In fact, I think it was our 2000 national convention that he spoke at, and he was associated in our circles. And I heard of him, but I've never met him in person. And a little while back, I was working with Cynthia Davis, who is a former legislator from Missouri, who is a leader in the Constitution Party. And I helped her with her podcast. And we were talking about something, and it just occurred to me that, hey, this Matt Truella, he'd make a good guest for the podcast. So Cynthia got in touch with him, and they did a whole hour or so session on this topic of the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. And in summary, it's the concept that there is a duty of any civil magistrate to interpose on behalf of the people whenever the higher authorities, the higher magistrates, go astray and go contrary to what is right, just, go contrary to the Constitution, that the lower magistrates have a duty to interpose on behalf of the people to protect our rights and to honor God and uphold the Constitution. And it's a concept that once was commonly understood, I'm sure, by all of our nation's founding fathers. It's the very concept they were acting on when they declared that that Great Britain had lost its right to call us their colonies, that we have a right ought to be free, because Great Britain had violated this concept and gone astray. So it's common knowledge for Americans, or should be, because it was common knowledge to our founders, but it's knowledge that we have greatly forgotten today. And I'm concerned that in America today, we primarily have two kinds of people. One who just mindlessly think that whoever's at the highest level of authority is in charge, and whatever they say we've got to do, because they're at the top of the chain of command, and we've just come to treat the federal government and the president much like they used to treat the king. And we've come to view them that way. And those who are thinking a little bit more read their Bible and say, well, according to Romans 13, we just have to obey the government. So whatever the government does or says, we've got to go along with it. And that's false as well. Michael.
And I was just going to comment that it doesn't help matters. We've got enough people in government behaving that way as well, including most definitely the president.
Absolutely. And this is, I think the most important thing is those in office need to understand the principle that these videos teach. They're the ones who need to be interposing for us, and particularly at the state level, standing up to the federal government and pointing out, wait a minute, you're not constitutionally authorized to do this. And so we really need all of our elected representatives to be tuning in and watching this, or maybe in the future find a way to convince them to come to a meeting and have Matt Trewhella come speak to them. And we, the people, need to be considering when we vote for people, whether the candidates understand this principle or have the courage to act on it. If we're not going to elect people who understand this, then we don't deserve to have our rights protected. So that's generally what this is about. And even the Romans 13 angle that I was saying, the church Christians in general think that, well, the Bible tells us you've got to obey the government, so we've just got to go along. And yet if you ask those same Christians, well, then what would have you done if you had lived in Germany during World War II? Would have you said, oh, sure, I'll go kill the Jews for you because the government says to? Well, of course, they all stand up and say, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. So then you're saying there is a point at which we should not obey government. Then the question becomes, well, what are the principles that determine when we should or should not obey government? Where do we draw that line? And that's why I believe we need to be studying these things and watching videos like this and having a discussion between ourselves. So that's the general groundwork. And why don't I go click the button? We can watch the first video, and Ted can kind of moderate, and we can have discussion in between each one.
Well, we do have our first visitor. My grandson has signed in from the living room.
How cool. Not exactly a long distance call, but okay. Okay. Now, let's see. I've never done screen sharing before, but I believe I am going to do it. Click share. And then try that.
Have you heard about the doctrine of a lesser magistrate? Probably not, because a tyrannical government doesn't want you to know about it. The federal government and their wacky minion friends at the local and state level would have you believe that you should always just obey them. The doctrine of the lesser magistrate rips the mask off that lie. The doctrine of the lesser magistrate declares that when the superior or higher ranking civil authority makes unjust or immoral laws or decrees, the lower or lesser ranking civil authority has both a right and a duty to refuse obedience to that superior authority. If necessary, the lesser authorities may even actively resist the higher authority. A memorable quote, which concisely summarizes the doctrine, was actually made by a higher magistrate. Roman Emperor Trajan once said, when honoring his subordinate with the sword, use this sword against my enemies if I give righteous commands. But if I give unrighteous commands, use it against me. Back in the 1st century, there was a Roman governor named Publius Petronius. Petronius was responsible for keeping Syria and Palestine under Roman rule. He received an order from his superior, Caligula. Caligula was the emperor of Rome. Caligula, who was convinced of his own divinity, ordered Petronius to assemble half his army and install an image of himself in the Jewish temple at Jerusalem. Petronius had the statue of the emperor made in Sidon and prepared his troops while he wintered in Ptolemy. To the Jews, a statue of the emperor in their temple was considered a severe affront to their religion. The Jews therefore sent numerous delegations to protest before the governor about the statue. Petronius was so deeply moved by the reasoning of their protests that he wrote to Caligula that he would not enforce his order and entreated the emperor to annul it. When Emperor Caligula received a letter from Governor Petronius, he was outraged and ordered Petronius to commit suicide. Soon after, however, Emperor Caligula's own Praetorian Guard assassinated him. Fortunately for Petronius, the ship carrying the order for him to commit suicide arrived after the ship carrying the news of the emperor's assassination. The statue was never placed in the temple. To learn more about the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate, please visit lessermagistrate.com.
The doctrine of the lesser magistrates. Okay, that was going into the next video. Okay, we're back, right?
Do
Right,
we have
right.
it back here? Okay, all right. So what kind of questions come into your mind when you hear this introduction to the concept of the lesser magistrate and his responsibilities?
Where does this doctrine come from?
Okay.
Is it written down somewhere?
Okay, so the question is, where does this doctrine come from, and is it written down somewhere? Do we know?
Well, the interesting thing is the earliest sources he cites are Roman and pagan, and have nothing at all to do with Judeo-Christian tradition. So I would very strongly suspect that if you were to dig, through the Old Testament deeply enough, possibly somewhere in Judges or Kings, there would be something that would.
In fact, yeah, Michael, you're making a good point. Answers Terry's question that a little later on, one of the videos, I forget if it's about number 4 or 5 or 6, somewhere in there. There's one that talks about a town, Magdeburg, I think it is, something like that. That this was first officially acted on there, as I believe is how it works. I just sort of previewed the videos. I didn't really watch it intensely and take notes. But anyways, the church in this town got together and said what the government is doing is wrong. And they really researched and wrote a really well thought out document on a biblical basis for disobeying civil authority when it goes astray. And that was the document that founded this, basically. So that's where we get the idea from. And it's something our founding fathers surely knew.
Another question might be, how does the Constitution, upon which we supposedly run our nation, how does that address something like this?
Has there been any court decisions that made reference to this?
Well, basically, I think just the basic setup of the, at least initially, allegedly limited enumerated powers of the Congress, and then especially the 9th and 10th Amendment. Preserving the powers to the state, the rights to the states and to the people.
And it's putting a limit on the federal government.
The idea being that the successive levels of government, as you got closer to the people, could potentially exercise a little bit more power because the people would be in more direct control.
How do you think that this impacts some judicial decisions? For instance, we were talking earlier about the person who was arrested for jury tampering because he was passing out a pamphlet about jury nullification outside the courthouse.
Good point. That concept of jury nullification. In fact, I think the Institute on the Constitution has like a 6-part video series on that whole concept and the rights and duties of the juror. But that's really an important thing that we also should understand and show a video on sometime, maybe, and make our topic of discussion, that our nation's founders in history, even the Supreme Court at some point, acknowledge that this is the right and duty of juries to judge not only the facts of the case, but the law and whether the law is just. And so that really ties in with the same concept, that the jury is to perform the same concept of the lower or lesser interposing when the higher authorities go astray and do something unjust. If it's unjust, the jury is supposed to nullify it and say, we refuse to find this person guilty because the law is unjust.
One of the other reasons behind a 12-person jury, so you're in theory getting the jury at random. So if you have, approximately 1/12, as small as 1/12 of the population that's opposed to whatever is going on,
Right.
that gives them a check.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the society would have to go really far astray for the jury to, fail its duty in this. When, like you say, only 1/12 would have to oppose it.
Okay, we have a Second Amendment in the Constitution.
Yeah.
How many of our gun laws are constitutional?
Almost done.
And the sheriff is bound to obey the Constitution or uphold the Constitution, not the gun laws that are unconstitutional, not the Supreme Court decisions that rule on the issues, right? He's not doesn't take an oath to uphold Supreme Court decisions. He's uphold the Constitution. Yeah, it's pretty clear. They can call, the Supreme Court can call white black and black white. That doesn't change reality. So if we had a sheriff, he could play that role and all these gun laws would be nullified.
Absolutely. Could and should be. Of course, everything comes back to we the people. If we the people were all, or at least a considerable portion of the people, even 1/4 of the population, were watching videos like this and understanding concepts like we're talking about, then we would elect sheriffs who understand these same things, and overnight, the unconstitutional gun laws around the country would be stopped.
So that'd be a good question to ask the next guy running for sheriff.
Absolutely.
How many guns, do you name a constitutional gun law?
Right, and we should come up with a list of,
Are you gonna enforce those?
yeah.
You have a comment, Karen?
Yeah, I just looked some of this up on Matt's website. And what he says in there is that Black's Law Dictionary defines interposition in this manner: the doctrine that a state, in the exercise of its sovereignty, may reject a mandate of the federal government deemed to be unconstitutional or to exceed the powers delegated to the federal government. The concept is based upon the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, reserving to the states powers not delegated to the United States.
Good.
And this could end up playing out very shortly. We're aware of the Supreme Court decision that basically authorized homosexual marriage. In Kentucky, they had Kim Davis, a county clerk, doing her job in the lesser magistrate. At that time, the then governor of Kentucky would not support her. And the most recent election, the good citizens of Kentucky elected themselves a new governor who had been supportive of Mrs. Davis. So the issue is not dead by any stretch of the imagination. And we look to have now the proper or an attempt to restore constitutional balance with the state and federal governments butting heads over something.
Yes. Yeah, that is cool. So this really is a relevant topic. I mean, you can't just say, well, this is irrelevant, you're too far from being able to act on it. No, it's being acted out in front of our eyes. Yeah.
But it is curious that based upon the ignorance, and by ignorance, I'm not talking about stupid. I'm talking about not knowing.
Yeah.
People uninformed, I guess is a better word. People who make decisions, go to a jury or go to the ballot box with not having any kind of information other than their self-imposed ignorance. And I don't mean that ignorance in a bad way. I mean that it's they don't know. And so what do we do to change? I was called for jury duty a 3 years back. I would have loved to serve on it because I wasn't working. I could arrange my schedule. I volunteer in a lot of areas, but I could arrange my schedule to be on the jury. I thought that would be a great experience. But unfortunately, I was too opinionated, I guess. And
You
so,
gotta be very smart to get yourself on the jury, get it over the statement.
yeah. And also, I admitted that I knew one of the police officers arrested, who was involved in the arrest. So that was fun.
The interesting thing being that arguably back in the day, the reason they wanted the jury drawn from the locality was because to a certain extent people in that locality would be known by reputation, so the juror would have a better chance of,
Sure.
you know, yeah, I know
The
some,
jury of your peers.
yeah.
Now it seems to be, if they know you, you're disqualified.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, who knows today?
Yeah. Yeah, you know,
Yeah, I know so-and-so, he's always been a liar, no, I ain't gonna trust him on the stand, or I know so-and-so, he's.
yeah, I know what goes on in his house, you know? Yeah, and so they call that prejudice. But it's actually knowledge. Okay, any other comments on
Tell me
this?
when.
We'll move on to the next one.
Okay, I'll go back to screen sharing mode, entire screen, share, and we'll try number 2.
The doctrine of the lesser magistrates is rooted in the doctrine of interposition. Interposition is that calling of God where one steps into the gap, willingly placing himself between the oppressor and his intended victim. An example of interposition in recent history is the Romanian Revolution of 1989. The revolution actually began in the city of Timisoara, where Laszlo Tokas was the pastor of a Reformed church. The Securitate, secret police, came to arrest the pastor, a common occurrence in Ceausescu's Romania. The people of the church learned of their pastor's impending arrest and gathered to blockade the doors of the church, to interpose on his behalf and resist his arrest. The secret police sent to arrest Laszlo Tokas were accustomed to compliance. When the people blocked the doors, they were stunned by these actions and merely parked their car down the street to wait the people out. As word spread, however, more and more people arrived to blockade access to the pastor. Within a few days, more than 1,000 people had surrounded the church and would not leave. News of this spread to other areas, and a nationwide revolution broke out. 2 weeks later, Ceausescu and his wife lay dead on the palace steps. Their 2-decade reign of terror was brought to an end. When it comes to the interposition of the lesser magistrate, he interposes on behalf of the people. He places himself in between the unjust laws or edicts of the higher authority and the people. He also acts in defense of the rule of law and abates the just judgment of God. When the higher authority drives his unjust, immoral laws or policies forward, the lesser magistrates are to step in and stop it. When Governor Petronius defied Emperor Caligula, he was actually performing an act of interposition on behalf of the Jews. In order to demonstrate his interposition, he called the Jews to Tiberias. When they arrived, there were 12,000 soldiers standing there. They thought they might be killed. So the soldiers were here and the Jews were here. And Governor Petronius actually stepped in between them. And then he declared to them this: I will send to Caligula and let him know what your resolutions are, and will assist your suit as far as I am able, that you may not be exposed to suffer on account of the honest designs you have proposed to yourselves. And may God be your assistant, for his authority is beyond all the contrivance and power of men. Governor Petronius illustrated his interposition by stepping between the soldiers and the Jews, by placing himself between the unjust and immoral law of the tyrant higher authority and the people. When will our lesser magistrates here in America interpose against a federal government that is out of control? To learn more about the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, go to lessermagistrate.com.
Stop sharing. We're back.
All right. Did that get your blood pressure up just a little bit? The idea that there actually is something that one person or a group of people can do, and how imperative it is that we begin to elect people at all levels that understand these concepts.
Well, what I thought was interesting about the study he cited there in Romania was that what got the ball rolling actually technically wasn't the magistrate, it was the people themselves.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things you'll sometimes hear people asking when it comes to butting heads with the government, what can one person, with a pistol do or something like that? And there is a story that I heard coming from that revolution in Romania. Yet at one point in time, they had a relatively heavily armed contingent of the Romanian secret police who decided that they really needed to get to the palace to reinforce the palace. And in order to do that, they decided to take a route that had them go through a cemetery. Now, as it turned out, there were some college students in that cemetery, and maybe they had actually heard that there were college students in this cemetery, and they might have thought, that, okay, we can blow our way through there more easily, perhaps. There was one tiny little problem with that. And those particular Romanian students were not in college. They were somewhat better known as the Romanian Olympic shooting team. I do not believe any of the secret policemen survived that little encounter.
Interesting. Yeah.
Now, granted, not everybody, who's necessarily going to want to be butting heads with their government is an Olympic class shooter, but you don't necessarily have to be in order to have the effect you might want.
And would that not be a reason why our government is so, and administration and legislators are so eager to disarm America?
Oh, yes.
Right.
Oh,
We
yeah.
can't imagine standing up to our government with a gun, but it's very no way coming back.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a comment
Sure.
Sure.
from Cynthia Davis.
Hi, Cynthia.
Okay.
She can probably, she's on the chat. She wants to know what's in the doctrine of the lesser magistrate for those of us who are not in public office. Do we have any remedies? She's upset because they fully funded Planned Parenthood in Congress today and fully funded the refugee program. So how does the doctrine of the lesser magistrate apply here for the average person?
Suggestions, comments?
Well, in the case in Romania, where that was a relatively easy one to see because basically it's initially we'll just protect the pastors, so basically form a wall around the pastors. So that level of protest was easy to see. In terms of the funding for Planned Parenthood and stuff like that, because of the way things are handled, it's a little bit trickier. But you start end up looking at potentially various different tax protests. Okay, I'm simply not going to file my income taxes. And if enough people do that, eventually the system collapses under its own weight. Of course, the problem is that people have to be willing to bear the potential cost of getting dragged into court. But if they're willing to do that, enough people, buck the IRS, simply don't file for taxes and play various different games to decrease the amount that's being withheld from their checks, then, through time that will have an impact.
Absolutely, yeah.
But they don't just spend the money they collect unless they borrow one.
Well, granted, they still print the money, a significant amount of money into existence.
Well, that's what they did with the omnibus spending bill. Then passed a budget. They authorized another $1 trillion.
1.8 trillion.
What's 8/10 of a trillion? The fact, Pastor, they passed a bill, a spending bill
Is it passed?
that, yes, and
It's out of committee.
Basically, they did it at about 2 a.m. either, you know, within the past few days. It was, you know, one of those. You know,
Both houses of Congress?
the House for sure, the Senate would be a slam dunk if it gets out of the House. The problem is Ryan, for all practical purposes, has been Obama's puppet,
sure, yes.
just like Boehner was.
Yeah,
And the Republican establishment as a whole has been all too willing to go along, and then curious as to why the Republican voters are basically dropping them like a hot potato.
and that's something that can work, certainly work in our behavior, on our behalf. If we're able to begin to inform people on things like we're seeing tonight, we just need to get the word out there. And you can pick up on it as individuals. We can pick up as individuals. When you hear a person complaining about what's going on, he says, okay, what are you doing about it? Do you know about the doctrine of lesser magistrate? Do you know the Constitution? Do you know
Jury nullification.
are you aware of these things? And do you know where your legislator stands? And you're so thinking, well, we love Kathy, or we love Patty, or whoever it might be. We need to be, and it's going to be kind of one person at a time. We'd like to see dozens, scores, hundreds, thousands, but it's going to be one person at a time, probably. You were going to say something, Dave. But you forgot what you were going to say.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's probably true.
I know back to Cynthia's question, while Karen was reading it to us, one thing that came to mind was a few years back, maybe in the first or second session where Matt Shea was serving in our legislature. Matt is our local state representative here, and one of the few truly constitutional legislators in the country, one of the handful, I would say. As I recall, he submitted a bill or a plan for states to withhold the federal income tax, basically saying, if I recall right, the idea would be for the state to collect the federal income tax and hold it and not give it to the federal government until the federal government gets in line with the Constitution.
Yeah.
And I believe that would be a very proper constitutional way to handle it, and very much in line with this doctrine of lesser magistrates. And as it was said, even though the federal government would just go ahead and print funny money out of thin air and continue to fund Planned Parenthood, at least it wouldn't be us funding it. It wouldn't be my money that I earned, that I gave to Planned Parenthood. It would be the federal government doing something immoral and unconstitutional and using valueless fiat currency to do it.
Good. All right. Other comments? Karen?
There's no more. Right. So.
Okay.
Another.
Why don't we do one more, and
Okay.
then we can kind of wrap things up and talk a little bit about what we're going to do next, perhaps the next meeting.
Okay, back to share entire screen, share, and here's number 3.
God has established 4 realms of government to which he has delegated authority. They are, number 1, self-government, 2, family government, 3, church government, 4, civil government. Each has its own role, function, and jurisdiction. Each of these governments has positions of authority. Self-government's authority, of course, is the individual. In family government, the man is the head of the home. His wife acts as his co-regent. Both have authority over children and property. In church government, there's the offices of elder, deacon, pastor. And in civil government, you have various positions of authority, from a policeman all the way to the president. The authority an individual possesses in any one of these 4 realms of government is delegated authority. In other words, their authority is derived from God. Their authority is not autonomous, nor is it unconditional. Rather, it is God-given, and thus they are to make sure they govern according to his rule. When someone in a position of authority makes laws or decrees contrary to God's law, he becomes a tyrant, as he is in rebellion to God's rule. Those under his authority are not to obey him when he does this. They may even have to actively resist him. The doctrine of the lesser magistrates reminds the higher authority that their authority is limited, because when the higher authority makes laws or policies contrary to the law and word of God, the lesser magistrate does not obey them. The higher authority is then confronted with his rebellion against God and the fact that his authority has limits. To learn more about the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, go to lessermagistrate.com.
I don't think that video came up in Joseph Goebbels' productions.
You probably wouldn't see it on Fox News
They
either.
didn't teach that to the Nazis.
Yeah.
That's a concept that is really, I guess, foreign to the typical citizen and every legislator, that our authority is delegated from God.
Yes.
Authority is never assumed,
Yes.
it's given.
Yeah.
I part that we started with self-government, and it reminds me of after 9/11, I had 3 children in college and 2 at home and 1 living elsewhere, and the 3 at college were at the same college, and I remember calling them up, and this was when the government was starting to round up people from Asian or East Asian, you know what I mean, India, Middle Eastern extraction. And they were holding people without warrant and without cause, really. And I asked, and other people were being, one man was shot in Arizona, but he was Sikh. People didn't know the difference between a Taliban and a Sikh. So I asked my children, because they had international students, I said, what do you do if someone starts harassing or bullying or abusing a person just because of their appearance or where they come from? Doesn't make them a terrorist. And they said, oh, Mama, it's okay. We know what to do. We just go stand in between them and stop it. And I think this is what we need to teach our children. If we don't understand that doctrine from ourselves, then our family, and then spread that out to the church and out to civil. If we don't understand it in ourselves first, we can't pass it on.
That's
And
right.
so when they said that, I don't know how they knew this, but that was their instinct, was to protect someone else's liberty, and someone else's person. And that is the doctrine of interposition. You put yourself in between. And so I think really we need to start, we need to turn around. In this country, we think so much federal down. We need to start teaching ground up.
Yeah.
When I teach the Constitution in the classroom once in a while, I've done this, and they have the pyramid that you teach the 3 parts of the government with this pyramid. Well, I kind of turn it upside down, and I put, this is local, states here, and the federal government's this little teeny tiny spot right here, and that's a whole new concept for people, but it's actually the reality of our system.
Yeah, but we have, well, that's the nature of the carnal flesh and the carnal mind, is we pervert everything. We turn it around backwards. And we have so perverted that and failed to understand that God is the head of all authority. And then he gave a measure of authority to man to steward over his planet for him. And man has delegated a subset of our authority to civil government. And here in the United States, we first delegated that authority to our states, and then the states turned around and delegated just a very tiny fraction of their authority to the federal government, just to tie the states together. And that is, like you say, it's so turned on its head.
Well, a contributing part of the problem, though, to a certain extent, has been both our freedom, our success, and advancing technology that has made it so much easier to travel from point A to point B. I mean, how many people here are natives of Washington State? So we've got two. In my life, I have bounced around all over the country, with the exception of, I don't think I've hit Alaska yet, and I don't think I've been through Montana yet, but I've lived in quite a few of the states of the Union. And most other people are somewhat similar in that they'll live for maybe half a dozen years here, move to another state for whatever reason, maybe live a dozen years there, move to another state, you know. Thus, they aren't as tied into their local city, county, and state level governments as they were back in the days of the founders, when most people, you know, lived in one state for most of their lives, or if they moved, they were moving to another state to spend the rest of their lives there, as in, you know, the westward expansion.
Yeah. Yeah, they really did think of themselves as a citizen of Virginia or a citizen of Massachusetts. But we don't really have that concept now. Citizen of Washington? No, I'm an American. Yeah, let's say, look at my watch or day planner, and it tells me, yes, I am in Washington today, or Idaho, or wherever, but we don't really think about our loyalty to our state government. That's
and that's one of the things that has served to weaken.
Right.
You know, and I don't know how really to address that, because we want people to be as free to move around as they want to be.
Right.
But the, you know, the corollary of that is that there's an extent to which it does weaken local and state governments.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't see an easy way out of that conundrum.
Well, we can encourage each other and as many others as possible to assimilate in becoming more familiar with our state constitution. I know that I'm not, except that on the matter of guns, it says shall not be infringed, right? Isn't that even stronger than the federal, or is it federal?
Federal say, you know, Innsbruck shall not be infringed, but everybody ignores that. It gets confused by the first part of the wording of the amendment about a well-regulated militia.
Right.
What they overlook is the fact that back in that day, a well-regulated militia was one that could perform standard battlefield tactical drills with precision. It was not one that necessarily had a whole raft of laws, rules, and ordinances stuck to it.
Yeah.
You know, it's, can you march for 20 miles and not straggle all over the countryside? Can you move from column to line and back to, you know?
And able to shoot.
Yeah.
And what is also throwing us off, though, is that nobody understands the word militia now. There's a really good teaching by Dr. Edwin Vieira on the militia. And back at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, every state had a militia, and everybody who worked on or signed the Constitution just had a firsthand knowledge of the fact that the militia is every able-bodied adult male.
And
Period.
weren't they provided arms if they, or at least
required to keep your a battlefield type weapon and gear? Yeah.
And related to that, are law enforcement officers encouraging us now to become armed?
Some of them are, yes.
Are any of them locally doing so?
I haven't heard word one from Ozzy, but there's been a sheriff in Michigan, a sheriff in Florida, I think a sheriff in Texas, who have come out and said, you know, look, you know, about the only way to deal with this is everybody who can pack, get the requisite permits and pack.
Yeah, police chief of Detroit as well. Permits.
Yeah.
And even, you know, the chief of Washington, D.C. came out and said that, you know, something like this goes down, your best bet is just try to swarm the guy.
Yeah.
Permits. To exercise your gun rights.
There is an extent to which life is kind of like a poker game. You've got to take the situation as it exists. If you go ahead and you bust up an attack, and it turns out you were not carrying lawfully, then that's a felony bust. Now, if you want to run that risk, if you really don't have to, be my guest. But that was one of the reasons why I eventually broke down and got a permit for Washington State, because if I did have to use it, then I was faced with the choice of either running away and, potentially looking at even if the initial shooting was justified, I'm now on the run with a murder warrant against me. Or going, yeah, I did it, and getting an automatic felony bust for having, violated the concealed carry law.
Yeah.
Do I like the idea that I have to cough up money to the state to exercise what should be a God-given and inalienable right? No, I don't. But there is an extent to which, you pays your money, you takes your choice.
Well, the problem isn't the paying the money so much as the asking of the permission for something that's constitutional, right?
Yeah.
We're in agreement, but it's a question of how much risk you want to have to run.
Right. The better alternative is we elect the kind of sheriffs that we were talking about earlier, who would tell the federal government that you don't have a right to restrict this and even confront the state law.
And the point of fact, there's been a petition I've seen circulating in a few places about, shifting Washington State over to a constitutional carry, which is basically no permit required for anything.
But we already have that with the Second Amendment. So we need a law.
Yeah.
I know,
I'll hold the Second Amendment.
but it would be good to make our state laws reflect that.
Yes.
All states are constitutional carry, we just don't know. And the government.
The
and
problem
people
is
don't
convincing
support
the police that you run into of
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And then
because-
butting heads with the judicial system, et cetera, ad nauseum.
right.
There are a
It would
variety.
be nice if we had an amendment that held our gun.
Like the federal
Wouldn't
one
it
and
be
the
nice?
state one, you mean?
Nullify all these bad laws that we have.
We can say those bad laws are null, and they are, but still, the law was passed by a legislature and it was signed by the governor some years ago, and it's there on the books. So the better thing to do is elect good people who will repeal the law.
Repeal the concealed carry permit law.
Right.
So that you do not need a permit to carry.
So, yeah,
All gun
and in
laws.
effect, making this a constitutional carry state.
Right.
All gun laws are in the Constitution.
Well, you would say the Second Amendment is
It's not a law, it's an amendment. It's unconstitutional because it violates the Second. Name a gun law that doesn't.
Notice the Second Amendment is in part a gun law. Is it not?
I wouldn't call it constitutional
It's
law.
not. Okay.
It's part of the Bill of Rights. It's a
Yeah.
statement of the rights that the
It's
people
not a
have
statute.
obtained.
The best statement I heard on the Second Amendment came from Jefferson, who said that the beauty of the Second Amendment is it would not be needed until they tried to take it away.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah. I just wanted to say I appreciated that in this last video, he talked about rights coming from God, and the lesser magistrate needs to intervene when the higher powers go contrary to God's law. And I think that is so key to this discussion, that there are a lot of people out there today who just don't want to obey government. They want to say, hey, we the people are sovereign, government can't tell us what to do. No, God is sovereign and he tells us what to do.
Exactly.
And this doctrine of the lesser magistrate only works when the lesser magistrate recognizes the authority of God and recognizes the laws of God and is interposing to stop something that's contrary to God. If we take God out of the equation, like I'm going to say the Libertarian Party, who I respect a lot of the people in the Libertarian Party, they're sincere, but when we do that kind of thing and take God out of the
We have
equation,
the potential for total anarchy.
that's it. Yeah, then for someone to use this doctrine of the lesser magistrate, he's going to interpose and stand up to the higher powers, but on what basis? Well, on the basis that I don't like it. Or we took a vote locally and the majority of the people agreed with this or that. Well, it doesn't mean it's moral or right. You've got to have a standard to go by. God has to be the standard.
Yeah. And it relates to all those four areas that you mentioned, beginning with the family.
Well, self-government first, then family government, then church government.
Church.
That is so key. That's an important lesson that so few people understand these days, that the separate jurisdictions of church, family, and civil government. And Robert Andrews gave a good presentation on that at our Constitution Day event a few months ago. In fact, that video is online too. In fact, I'm going to get it added to our YouTube channel pretty soon here. But he had a little more time to expound on it, that these three jurisdictions are separate, and government ought not be interfering with the family to tell them how to run their business, just like the family ought not interfere with church, church ought not interfere with government. Each has their sphere of their jurisdiction, and each are directly under God and are accountable to care for the good of the other. So,
Now, one of the more scary things I read at one point in time was a study that had been done by, I believe he was a sociologist, went to Germany after World War II, and basically started doing an in-depth study of a small town in Germany to more or less try to find out what was happening as the Nazis came to power and consolidated power of this, that, and the other. And one of the things the Nazis were trying to do, and to a certain extent were able to do successfully, was to break down the church and to a certain extent the family so much, such that you were then more or less an isolated individual against the state with no significant support network.
right.
So, any type of resistance then becomes that much harder because you don't know who you can turn to, who you can trust, etc.
Real good. We have that now.
To a certain extent, yes, and that's one of the things that Obama is, and others in, the federal government are kind of trying to set up. They want to get us split up into small little groups that are more interested in butting heads with each other than they are the central government. Cautionary tale. There I was in the Persian Gulf for Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Desert Saber, riding around on, the flagship for the war effort. And I got to talk one day with a gentleman who was, the head officer for the Admiral's Intel Department. So one of the things I asked him, was why don't, you get the various different groups together, form an anti-Saddam coalition? And his response was that they hated each other so much, they couldn't get them all together in the same hotel, let alone the same room, or they'd be having to mop up the blood off the floor. So Saddam was actually able to let his people be armed because, the various different groups are looking at Saddam as being the lesser of the evils compared to the guys living next door.
Yeah.
And if we let that happen to us here in America, and that's one of the things about this total complete open borders, let's let everybody in with no attempt at acculturation at all. You're setting up balkanization, split into various different little groups, and your ability to resist what the federal government is doing becomes lesser and lesser and lesser.
Immigration without assimilation.
Yeah, that's the big problem that we've got right now. And then especially importing all these guys in who may or may not have terrorist ties, and then the ones who do, how do we clamp down?
Buying them homes, giving them food, paying for other things too.
With the tax dollars they either took from us or printed out of thin air.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that went through in that omnibus that got passed at 2 a.m. in, the last day or so. A significant chunk of change for that program.
Lesser magistrates, how about we the people? That's an emphasis that Red Beckman always gave us whenever he spoke. Because the Constitution came from the people.
Well, that is the last line of defense. If everybody that we've elected at every level of state, local, federal, city, government all fails to interpose, the only ones left are ourselves to interpose, like they did with
The Romanians did.
Romania. Yeah, it started with the people.
Yeah, okay, no, you're not going to arrest their pastor, and as the word got out, more people flocked.
But it takes not only a courageous leader like that pastor who's willing to die for his principles, but it takes courageous people who will recognize a courageous leader and rally around them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You can't be free unless you're willing to run the risks inherent in it. And another problem is you can't be free unless you're willing to take responsibility for your own actions, self-government, in a much larger way.
Yeah, that's right.
You literally have to be willing to kind of walk the tightrope without a net.
And that's what's so hard when you've got, as they say now, over half of the population getting some kind of government subsidy or program or something. We live here in one of the most quote-unquote conservative congressional districts in the country. Everybody's conservative and votes Republican, but they vote in a Republican who's giving away all kinds of federal money to farm subsidy programs. Oh, well, it's because we're a farming district. All the farmers love their subsidies. So we're hooked on that.
Kathy McMorris is the most conservative congressman from Washington State, and she gets an F from conservative relief.
Right.
Well, I mean, look at what we've got for local city government in Spokane.
Well,
That part of the problem is, such a minuscule percentage of the population turned out to vote in the last election.
yeah. But that should be a point of encouragement. I always like to point out how few people actually vote, how few people are even registered, and how many fewer even vote. And then when you divide it between 2 or 3 candidates, like 10 or 15% of the population voting as a block could determine every election.
Especially during an off-year election, that's when we have more leverage.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why local offices are so important and such a good thing to try to get good people into.
Especially if they understand the doctrine of the lesser magistrate.
Right.
Now, kind of sort of related to the militia in a similar vein, people may have heard the term posse comitatus, but not be exactly familiar with what it means. That there had been a group running around at one point in time with that name that gave bad press to the entire concept. But actually, posse comitatus is within limits directly related to the concept of the militia. Basically, what it means is that a sheriff, if he needs to, significant force to enforce the law, can normally call out a posse. And the posse comitatus is basically the maximum strength posse he could summon, which would be, the entire military strength of the county.
Okay.
So when they passed the laws after the Civil War about not needing the federal government to come down and enforce state law, they called it the posse comitatus law because it was recognizing the authority of the sheriff to deputize every adult male in his county to use as a force to enforce the law. And then that also tied the sheriff being an elected office to basically pretty much doing what the people in the county wanted, because if he was doing something that they didn't want, he'd call out the posse, nobody would show up.
Right. Yeah. Good stuff.
All right, good discussion. We're approaching 8:15, and I think that we're going to aim for breaking up here in the next few minutes. If it's acceptable, I think it'd be nice for us on the next meeting to go ahead and hit at least 3 more of these little videos to talk about, or perhaps 4. I think there are a total of 10 or 12 in the group.
I think there's 13 and a couple others that are related that you can go off into if you wanted to.
And actually, I have been doing some fairly extensive study on some interesting information relative to education on each of the articles of the Constitution and certain sections of the Constitution. I've been doing some research and putting together some stuff. That video series that I talked to you about before, it's not as it's a term I need. It's not as easily understood as I think it could be. And so I don't know if you looked at any of those yet or not.
I hadn't got around to that.
It's interesting stuff, but it's kind of like up here.
A little more for the legal and jurist mind,
Yeah.
whereas we're trying to relate to the common man.
Right. The
Okay.
basic understanding, I think that people have a basic understanding of each of the articles of the Constitution, the amendments, and certain sections that are brought up that are significant that we need to have an understanding of. So I was thinking that each time we have a meeting, let's cover a little bit, and actually Bob Lowe had suggested that we do a little bit each meeting on the Constitution. That would be helpful too, plus this. And then if you run across Karen or anyone else, or you're still listening, Cynthia, of speakers or presenters that we could have, we'd love to have that too. And they don't necessarily have to be here. We'd like to have them in person, but if we can do video hookups, that's great.
Right. Sounds good to me.
Anything else?
Next month is Martin Luther King's birthday.
Where are we going to
Should we
be?
celebrate that?
No, I'm saying that video. I've been
Oh, yeah, let's, think about that. So the third Thursday is the 18th, no, not the 18th, I'm looking at February. March 21. And not March 20, January 21.
January 21, okay.
When is the late Reverend's birthday?
I think they celebrated on the 20th, but they worked things around.
They said it's on the 18th, yeah.
Yeah, it falls on a Monday now. so
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, it's,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, it's the third Monday.
holidays are only for people who don't have to really work.
January,
And we meet on Monday?
we meet on the 21st.
Okay, yeah. 21, okay. On a Thursday. And this place is working out good for us,
So far, yeah, I mean, if we grow it, that'll be.
I think we all like our food. I liked whatever Michael was having for dessert. I want to find out what that is and do that next time.
What was the date? Was it the 20th or?
21st
Okay.
of January. Day before I turned 72.
All right,
Oh my gosh.
congratulations.
Okay.
You don't look a day over 70. You're lucky you look younger now.
Yeah.
Is that beard that dates you? All right. Well, anything else? And Karen, we'd love to have any input that you might have for us to say, hey, consider this. We'd love to hear from you too.
Okay, thank you.
We love it when you come this way, so.
We had about 4 people today.
You what?
We had about 4 people today on the chat.
Cool. Okay. Okay.
Good.
That proves it works and we can promote it to others.
Do we know what states they were from?
No. Cynthia. Okay, thank you guys. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
George Washington came to St.